Hello, I'm Lugatorix and welcome to my Russia faction guide for Medieval 2 Total War. Russia is an interesting faction. I would actually say it's probably my favourite. You can probably guess why if you know my channel pretty well. It's because I like my missile cavalry, and that is particularly what Russia is good at, along with melee cavalry, like it says in the strength section. So Russia start off with one settlement. You can see it's the blue region up here where Russia logically is. So they start off with a very small empire, one of the smallest in the game. I think, well, Denmark has one starting place as well, but there's very few factions that only have one settlement to begin with. But as you can see, a lot of rebel territory around for Russia to take advantage of. So strengths, like I said, great mix of missile and melee cavalry, and weaknesses, poor early infantry and missile units. If this sounds relatively similar to Scythia of Rome Total War, then you are correct, because it is a similar sort of faction. Campaign rules on long is to hold 45 regions, including the Constantinople region and the Jerusalem region, which I think is harder than a lot of the other factions, because a lot of them is just the Jerusalem region. So for example, well, that's just the Constantinople region, for example. England, just the Jerusalem region, but no, Russia, it is Constantinople and Jerusalem. So very interesting stuff. So what we're going to do, first of all, we're going to have a look at the unit roster. I'll talk about the units. There's not a particularly big roster, I have to say, and then I'll get on to talking about some campaign strategy. Okay, so this is the Russian unit roster, and like I said, it's not the biggest in the game. So we start off with peasants. We always start off with peasants, and peasants, like it says here, basically good for only cannon fodder. Attack of 4, defense of 3, very low stats in general, poor morale, never ever rely on them in battle. Next up we have woodsmen. Hardy folk from the forests of northeastern Europe armed with a large axe. So, much better attack. 13 attack is pretty solid for an early unit, but as you can see, defense of 1. They are basically not armoured at all, although they are effective against armour themselves. So, they can pack a punch, they can do a bit of damage, but really a good charge into them, and they're going to collapse pretty quickly, purely for the fact that they're not armoured, which is a bit of a sort of downside. Obviously, they have a combat bonus in woods. That would be pretty illogical if they didn't. Vulnerable to missiles, like they said, because of the poor armour. So this means really, if you want to deal with these guys, you just got to fire archers or whatever at them and they will collapse. But they can still pack a punch with their 13 attack. I just don't like the low defense personally. Next up, Spear Militia. Spear Militia, very common unit for a lot of factions. Commoners and peasants levied into local militias to defend settlements, and they are a more defensive unit. 7 defense, which is 6 higher than the woodsmen of course, but less attack. They are more likely to just stand there, defend a point in a village or whatever in the early game. That's what they're good for. On the open field, they're less useful. I would prefer to use them as garrison in cities or villages. Then we go on to Spearmen, relatively similar unit, basically better version of what we just saw. Attack of 7, so that's a step up. Defense of 13 is also a step up. The fact that, and I mention this every time, they can do a Skiltrum is good. It's a defensive formation, relatively similar to a phalanx. This means they're harder to break down, and if a unit like cavalry, for example, charges into the front of them, they're going to suffer because of that Skiltrum. And like it says, bonus fighting cavalry. So again, these guys are a good defensive unit, particularly for holding villages and stuff, and can deal especially well with cavalry, which makes them relatively useful on the open field as well. Next up, okay, this is where the pronunciation time goes wrong. I apologise if I'm saying this wrong. Berdish Axeman, I don't know, you can read it hopefully better than I can. So, as per usual with Axeman units, they are more attack offense focused than defensive focused, and you can see this by the fact that they have 17 attack and 9 defense. 9 defense isn't bad, but the 17 attack is pretty solid indeed. They're effective against armour, which again is commonplace with Axeman, and that's pretty good, particularly in the later game, because obviously more troops are going to have armour, so if you can have something that can combat that, that's really good. And the fact they have good morale means they will stand up for a while and fight, which is of course also excellent. You don't want your units routing in battle. Now we have Dismounted Druzina. Sorry if I said it wrong. Fierce warriors wearing mail armour and armed with a wicked axe. Yeah, a wicked axe. Act as bodyguards for chieftains. Attack of 11, defense of 15. So this is a more sort of all-round axe unit. You can see because their defense is a lot better than the previous Axeman unit. Good morale as well. Combat bonus in woods or snow. So basically this is a I would say a more sort of defensive version of these guys, purely because their defense is higher. Their attack is significantly lower, but I'd say it's sort of a more all-round unit. Personally, I'd probably just prefer these guys because the fact they're effective against armor means they're going to be more useful in attacking a wider variety of troops at all points in the game. And if you're using Axemen, really, you're not going to be trying to defend a point with Axemen, so I'd rather just boost the attack personally. Now we have Dismounted Boyar Sons. I hope I'm saying this right. So, these young adventurers wear light mail or light brigandine armor and carry an axe. 11 and 15 as well, so you can see relatively similar to the previous unit. Good morale as well. In fact, it is literally almost identical, so not a huge amount more to say about these guys. I suppose the only difference between these two is these are wearing light mail and these guys are wearing normal mail. So light mail armor obviously means they're going to be faster, and these guys obviously dismounted, they should be on a horse but they're not. Now we have the missile troops, and like the game said, Russia has a poor array of missile troops. It's something, well, I say that, sorry, infantry missile troops. I must correct myself. So these guys, Archer Militia, attack of 2, defense of 1 is very, very poor. In fact, it is worse than the peasants. The attack is like half of that of the peasants. So these guys will not be fighting in the melee at all. But their missile attack is 5. So they can do an alright job from distance, but to be honest, a missile attack of 5 is still pretty low. Archer Militia are armed with a small bow, so again, it means they're not particularly strong. They have a knife, which they basically do nothing with, and if they're lucky enough, some armour. Well, these starting guys have basically no armour at all. They are basically peasants holding a bow. That is what I would call them, essentially. And then we have peasants holding a bow. Yeah, basically the same. A peasant archer is armed with a small bow and a knife, not to be relied upon. Very, very similar to the previous unit, to be honest. These guys can use flaming missiles, but they're vulnerable to missiles themselves. As I say, these guys do not rely on them in the melee at all, and do not, to be honest, rely on them in the missile purpose. They're alright if you stick them in a town or something, you put them on the walls. They might be able to do a good job from distance, but to be honest, they're not going to be a hugely impactful troop. Relatively weak, I would say. Then we have Crossbow Militia. Slightly more advanced, attack of 6, defense of 7, so they are definitely more competent in the melee. Still nothing amazing if you compare them to these guys, they are significantly inferior, but they're okay. Missile attack of 9 is almost double that of the peasant archers, so that's good. I suppose not amazing, however, obviously in the later game you get troops using gunpowder weapons and they're going to have a lot higher missile attack, obviously. Effective against armour though is good, and it's a step up from the peasants. As I mentioned before, the Axemen, any unit that is effective against armour will be more useful across the whole campaign rather than just the beginning. And no, I still haven't learnt how to say these guys, so you can read. I literally can't say it. In literally every faction guide, these guys crop up, and I just cannot pronounce it, and I don't want to pronounce it wrong. Fired at close range, these noisy, smoky, and lethal weapons cause morale damage as well as physical hurt, and that's really cool. So in the melee, nothing special at all, but you're not going to be using these guys in the melee. Their missile attack 14, which is significantly better than the archers we just looked at. But what is really cool is that it causes morale damage, fear, because obviously gunpowder, other factions and troops aren't used to gunpowder. It means they're more effective against armor, because obviously a gunpowder weapon is going to be more effective than a bow and arrow. So essentially these guys are pretty solid, but again, you're not going to be able to get these guys straight away, so you've got to take that into consideration as well. Bear in mind, by the point that you get these guys, probably a lot of troops will have armour, so they'll be less effective than against lower standard troops. Then we have Dismounted Dvor. In the service of the local prince or high status boyar, Dvor make excellent archers when dismounted. Attack of 11, defense of 15, missile attack of 11. So pretty competent in the melee, particularly on defense. It's rare for a missile unit to have such good defense, but I suppose this is a late game unit, so you kind of expect that because armor and everything is improved by that stage. Still pretty solid in the melee. The missile attack is a little bit underwhelming. It's only 11. If you compare them to the previous unit, it was 14. But the advantage of these guys are that they are long-range missiles, which is good. You can start hitting the opponent from distance before they can even reach you, and that is a very valuable asset to have. Then we have Cossack Musketeers. They're highly trained gunners in light armour. Missile attack of 17, it's as good as you're going to get for infantry missile troops in Russia. 12 attack, defense of 9, which is pretty solid. They've got a lot of good other bonuses, which is pretty cool. Long range missiles, good morale, very good stamina. They will be able to hold up in melee or missile fire. Actually, they're vulnerable to missiles, so forget that. They'll be able to hold up in a melee combat if they have to as a last resort, but that shouldn't be the major concern because obviously musketeers are not going to be on the front line. Still, long-range missiles, as I mentioned previously, are still very, very useful in a battle. Light armour means that they are obviously better than the early peasant troops, which basically have a defense of 1. So now we'll get on to the cavalry, which of course is Russia's forte. So cavalry militia to start off with. Cavalry militia are poorly trained and equipped, but are still capable of charging down the right enemy. Probably not the best example of really good Russian cavalry, but these guys are the basic stuff. They're light cavalry, and like I said, they're basically used to charging down certain weaker enemies. Particularly are good for in a late stage in the battle where you have troops routing and you want to charge down as many troops as possible. Cavalry militia will kind of do that job, kind of like Equites. So don't expect them to be fighting for a long time and being able to stand up to a lot of pressure, because that's not really what they're for. They're more for chasing down certain units like the game suggests. Then we have Druzina, fierce cavalry warriors wearing mail armour and armed with spear and a wicked axe. I love that. Acting as a bodyguard for chieftains. Attack of 11, defense of 15. So defense of 15 is pretty solid for cavalry, particularly early game cavalry. Good morale, which again is very, very good. These guys can stand up to a lot of pressure, a lot more definitely than the cavalry militia. A very, very solid troop, I would say for sure. And the fact that they are bodyguards obviously means they have a good defense. Now, cavalry obviously isn't really for just charging in and fighting for a long time in one area. They are more for a quick charge and then get out, or chasing down certain units or flanking. But still, the fact that you can have cavalry that can, be in a sustained fight for a significant amount of time is pretty cool indeed. Especially as they haven't even got amazing armour either. Then we have, of course, the General's Bodyguard, which you'd expect to be good. Defense of 18 is very, very solid. Like I said, that is pretty good indeed. And the attack of 14 with a charge bonus of 5. Well armoured, very good stamina. This is a very solid General's Bodyguard indeed. And then you have the Tsar's Guard, which is quite cool to say, actually. Household troops of the Tsar. These are formidable, well armoured, elite Eastern European heavy cavalry. Defense of 19. These guys are well armoured. You can see just by the horse that they're very well armoured. These are kind of really elite cavalry, particularly in terms of defence. Attack of 14, again, very solid. Comparable to General's Bodyguard unit, which, if you consider they are the elite unit, and this is not a unit guarding a general, then this is pretty cool indeed. You can have several of these on the field, and they will do a good amount of damage, and they will be able to stand up for the whole battle and not take losses. Then we of course have the late General's Bodyguard, which are basically a better version of the previous one, because they are better defensively and they are more well armoured, which is more important, to be honest, because obviously as the troops go along, they're going to have better attack the opposition. These guys will be able to stand up to some hits. 8 charge bonus is pretty cool indeed, meaning they'll have an attack of 21 if they charge in, which is really, really good. Now we'll get on to the archer cavalry, the missile cavalry, and we start off with Kazakhs. Kazakhs are accustomed to being on horseback. They make good horse archers, but are vulnerable in melee. Basically very similar to Scythian horse archers if you've played Rome Total War, which I have played quite a lot of. They will not last in the melee at all. They will collapse very, very quickly. They are vulnerable to missiles, but a missile attack of 6 is okay for missile cavalry. The fact that they are fast moving though means that they can do a lot of damage skirmishing around units, and they can't get to them, which is very, very important. Then we have Boyar Sons. These young adventurers wear light mail or light brigandine armour. Sounds familiar. Well, they were dismounted earlier. And they carry a javelin and an axe. So these guys are kind of more all-round. They are competent in the melee. Defense of 14 is very solid for a missile cavalry unit. But these guys, 8 missile attack because they're using javelins, which means they are effective against armour, which is really, really cool. And this is, yeah, I would say a solid all-round missile unit. More so than the archers. The archers are more specialised to one certain thing. These guys, of course, once they run out of missiles, will not be completely useless in battle, whereas these guys pretty much will be unless you're chasing routing units. Then we get on to Cossack Cavalry, a missile attack of 8, which is pretty solid, defense of 11 and attack of 9, with a charge bonus of 4. Charge bonus of 4 for a missile cavalry is pretty good. Good morale, very good stamina, fast moving. These guys will skirmish around units, do a lot of damage, tire them out, and they won't be able to be hit. And if they do get hit, they are okay in the melee. They will not collapse straight away like the Kazakhs will. Then we have the Devor Cavalry. These guys are basically better versions because they have a defense of 16. You can see that they are better armoured because you just look at the horse, look at the guy on the horse. Pretty good stuff. Good morale, good stamina means they are less likely to collapse, and a missile attack of 10 for Archer Cavalry is pretty solid as well. They will do a good job. So I've discussed the siege equipment before. I discussed that in the England faction guide, so if you want to learn about, bombards or cannons or anything like that, go to my England faction guide and I've discussed that there. So what we'll do now, we'll have a look at the campaign strategy on the campaign map.
Russia faces invasion by nomadic tribes and foreign conquerors. Its harsh landscape has given rise to a steadfast people, and their devotion has led them to great deeds. To survive, the Russians must fend off wild adversaries. To become an empire, they require a leader who will steal the kingdom and make its borders impenetrable.
Okay, so this is the starting position for Russia. As you can see, they only have one settlement. It is Novgorod. Now, what I'm going to do is turn off the Fog of War. As I've explained before, I don't play with the Fog of War off. The only reason I'm doing this is because I want to see what's going on. And it's much easier for me to show you where I would expand on what settlements to take if you can actually see what's going on. So I'm just going to do that very quickly. There we go, so we can now see what's going on. So Russia is probably the most isolated faction, one of the most isolated factions in the whole game, because it is literally tucked away in this corner. To the north is a endless void, and basically there's nothing in terms of factions here. So you have a lot of opportunity to make a large empire very, very quickly, because there's not really much competition to take settlements like Helsinki, for example. So my advice, basically blitz the rebel settlements. They should be relatively easy to take because they're rebel, although rebel settlements are harder to take in Medieval 2 Total War than Rome Total War. They've been sort of buffed slightly, I would imagine. Well, yeah, that is the case. So taking settlements like Riga, Vilnius, Smolensk, and then particularly places like Thorn and Kiev and Moscow and Ryazan, very, very important. You could take 5, 6, 7 settlements already. And it's important you do quickly because the Hungarians and the Poles will be after them as quickly as you are. So that is what I do. Think about how best really you can efficiently take a settlement. So for example, the Grand Duke over here, I would probably move him over to Moscow and then he could go to Ryazan like that. Maybe a small force could then be sent over to Bulgar, but the bigger force could go down to Sarkel, but more importantly probably towards Kiev. I'd then have another force going to Smolensk and probably try and muster up another force to go towards Riga and Vilnius. Something like that. You know, you need to think you have a couple of armies here, you have a small garrison inside Novgorod. Get them outside of Novgorod, because that's not going to be taken by anyone. There's going to be no one, there's no faction that's going to take Novgorod. So clear it out, just put a peasant in there if you have to, and start taking these rebel settlements. It's priority, you take as many rebel settlements, and you can build quite a large empire early on. Now, as you expand in this direction, you basically have no choice but to encounter Poland or Hungary. So they're the two factions you want to eliminate first. Now, personally, I would go for Poland. I believe it to be the stronger faction. So once you take Vilnius, provided you take it before the Poles do, which if you're quick, you should be able to do. You know, it's not too far away. Then I would try and blitz Halich and Krakow. It's important you do that because the Poles don't start off with a very big empire. So if you take them down early on, that's fine, they won't be too much of a threat. But if you start taking Breslau, Thorn, Vilnius, they start to get a little bit of a bigger empire and they will be harder and more difficult to take down later on in the game. The same goes for the Hungarians, although I would go for them second. So once you've consolidated the sort of Polish region, you've taken Thorn and Vilnius and all that, then it's time to move south and strike against the Hungarians for a similar reason. They only start with two settlements, Budapest and Bran, and they will expand into Iasi and Bucharest and Sofia if you are not careful, and they will start to have a bigger force which will threaten you in the later game. So my advice is basically go for the rebel settlements, take out Poland, then take out Hungary. Now you will notice that you will at some point be bordered by the Seljuks. Honestly, don't go for the Seljuks. There's a couple of reasons why I just wouldn't bother going too far down this way. Basically, I believe these are the Caucasus Mountains, I hope. I wouldn't go further south than the Caucasus Mountains, in my opinion. There's two reasons. One, Seljuks aren't particularly strong, for one reason we'll discuss in a minute. And it's much more important to go for Poland and Hungary. They are stronger factions, more profitable area of the world. But also, if you, let's say, go really super fast and you get to Tbilisi and Yerevan, well, then you're going to have the trouble with the Mongols, and the Mongols might take them off you anyway if you overexpand. So really, I'd probably just try and get an alliance with the Seljuks and just say, look, you can have Tbilisi and we'll stay north of the mountains over here. That's probably what I'd do. So 3 areas of advice basically. Take the rebel settlements, which should be relatively easy. You've got a lot of them around, but then really start focusing on Poland, particularly Poland, and then move down to Hungary. After that, you've got a lot of choice. You can go down and deal with the Byzantines if they're looking weak. If you're brave, you can go for the Holy Roman Empire, or maybe you want to go further north, go through the Scandinavian region and take out Denmark. That's really up to your discretion. It's too many variables to decide now which I would do. I personally would probably go south towards the Byzantines, particularly because they're just a bit weaker in the mid to late game. But that's my personal opinion. You basically have to look at the map and see where you want to strike. It all depends on where armies are and all of that. So, basic advice, rebel settlements, Poland, Hungary, and ally with the Seljuks. That's my general advice. So, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was helpful in some capacity. And I will be back making more Medieval 2 Total War faction guides very, very soon. I intend to make all the faction guides for Medieval 2. And of course, I'll be back with more Rome Total War content as per usual. So, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you around.